So when we think about ancient history, our modern minds naturally try to map events onto a straight chronological line.
Right, like a literal timeline.
Exactly. We want a clear start date, a specific sequence of events, and a definitive end. But, if you try to apply that rigid linear timeline to the ancient Indian subcontinent, the whole system just completely breaks down.
Oh, it falls apart. The epic mindset of ancient India, it doesn't use timelines at all. It uses these massive repeating cycles.
And it's fascinating because it completely alters how we understand historical figures. Take Jain cosmology, for example.
Hmm.
You encounter this deeply revered heroic figure like Prince Rama.
Right.
Now, in our modern Western influence framework, we try to pinpoint his reign to like a specific century. But in these ancient traditions, he is part of the eighth recurring cosmic triad. He exists alongside his brother Lakshmana and the antagonist Ravana.
And the timeline they give is just wild.
It is. The texts tell us he lived a mind-bending 84,000 years before a much later historical figure from the 9th century BCE.
Wow.
The scale is just staggering. I mean, we're talking about eras that span tens of thousands of years, where human lifespans stretch into the impossible and the universe is just constantly breathing in and out, creating and destroying itself.
It really forces us to ask what history actually meant to the people writing these texts. Because for them, history wasn't about logging objective dates in a ledger.
Right, it wasn't an Excel spreadsheet.
Exactly. It was about moral truth. Time was this vast rotating wheel, and these epic figures served as eternal archetypes. They represented duty, righteousness, and cosmic balance.
So pinning them to a calendar year was completely irrelevant to the spiritual payload of the story.
Irrelevant.
But then something abrupt happens. We move out of those misty mythological eons, and we just crash headfirst into the 3rd century BCE.
The shift is jarring.
It really is. Suddenly, we aren't relying on oral traditions detailing 84,000-year reigns. History gets literally, physically hammered into the earth.
Carved into stone.
Yes.
Yeah.
Carved into polished stone pillars weighing 50 tons, dragged across the continent. We shift from navigating the past by the stars of mythology to having a hard geographical GPS coordinate. And that incredible transition is the foundation for our deep dive today.
We are looking at the life of Ashoka the Great.
The 3rd emperor of the Mauryan dynasty.
Right. His reign is really the fulcrum point where the Indian subcontinent transitions from epic myth into a scientifically verifiable, archaeologically documented state.
And our mission for this deep dive is to bridge that massive gap for you. We are going to explore how a single man built a continental empire, look at the brutal mechanics of how ancient power was seized, and, dive into a philosophical revolution that completely rewrote the DNA of global religion.
It's a huge story.
It is. But before we get to the man himself, I am stuck on a major logistical problem here.
Okay, what is it?
Well, if we have these giant 50-ton stone pillars scattered from modern-day Afghanistan all the way to Bangladesh, how on earth did the man who put them there just vanish from human memory? Because we've got centuries where Ashoka essentially disappears from the historical record.
It is one of the greatest vanishing acts in historical scholarship, honestly. To understand that blackout, you have to look at the fragility of ancient memory.
Okay.
So after the Mauryan Empire collapsed, which was just a few decades after Ashoka's death, the political center of gravity shifted.
Right.
And the script he used for his pillars, a script we now call Brahmi, it gradually fell out of use. Regional languages and alphabets just evolved past it.
So people couldn't read the billboards anymore.
Exactly. Fast forward 1,000 years, and the local populations living right next to these towering pillars couldn't read a single word carved into them. The stones were there, but they were mute.
That's wild.
It is. So Ashoka was reduced to just a few obscure, contradictory references in religious texts locked away in distant monasteries.
So how did we get his voice back? Someone had to crack the code, right?
Yeah, that brings us to the 1830s. There was this British antiquarian and assay master named James Prinsep.
Okay.
He was working at the Mint in Calcutta, and Prinsep was just obsessed with ancient coins and inscriptions.
I always wonder about the actual mechanics of deciphering a dead language.
Yeah.
Like, if there is no Rosetta Stone, no bilingual text sitting there handing you the translation, where do you even begin?
You look for patterns. That's the only way. Prinsep had an influx of ancient coins coming in, and he also had access to careful sketches of these pillar inscriptions.
Okay.
And he started noticing that a very specific sequence of characters kept terminating the lines on these Buddhist monuments.
A repeating phrase.
Right. He hypothesized, quite brilliantly actually, that this repeating sequence was a grammatical suffix indicating possession.
Ah, like an apostrophe S.
Exactly, specifically the word for of, or gift of, which is a really common marker on ancient donations.
Okay, that makes sense.
So by cross-referencing this assumed grammatical structure with bilingual coins found further west where Greek names were printed alongside early Indian scripts, he slowly assigned phonetic values to the Brahmi characters.
He literally reverse engineered the alphabet.
He did. And when he finally translated the major pillar edicts, he found they were written by a king referring to himself as Priyadasi.
Priyadasi. What does that mean?
It translates roughly to beloved of the gods, or he who regards everyone with affection.
Which, to be fair, is a phenomenal public relations title.
Oh, it's great PR.
But Princep didn't immediately know who Priyadasi was, right?
Initially, no. Because the actual name Ashoka rarely appears on the stones, Princep thought Priyadasi might be a king from Sri Lanka.
Oh, interesting. So how did they figure it out?
The breakthrough came when scholars started connecting the epigraphic record, the stones, with literary records. A civil servant in Ceylon named George Turner translated a Sri Lankan Buddhist chronicle called the Dipavamsa, and that manuscript explicitly stated that the title Priyadasi belonged to King Ashoka, the grandson of Chandragupta Maurya.
The two halves of the map finally align.
Exactly.
But, this brings up a massive structural issue for anyone trying to study this guy. Because now that we can read the sources, we realize our sources completely hate each other.
They really do.
They are fiercely contradictory. I mean, on one side, we have the stones, Ashoka's own inscriptions, which are the earliest self-representations of imperial power in India.
Right.
And on the other side, we have these Buddhist legends, which are themselves deeply divided between a North Indian tradition written in Sanskrit and a Sri Lankan tradition written in Pali.
We really have to dissect those sources because treating them as objective fact is a huge trap for anyone looking into this.
Yeah, lay it out for us.
Well, the inscriptions, the Rock and Pillar Edicts, they are masterpieces of political propaganda. Scholar John S. Strong emphasizes that these were not diaries. Ashoka wasn't pouring out his innermost, unfiltered thoughts.
Right.
They were meticulously drafted public decrees.
So if you're listening, think of it like trying to reconstruct the true private personality of a modern CEO using nothing but their heavily vetted, focus-grouped corporate press releases or their quarterly earnings reports.
That's a perfect analogy.
Every word on those stones is doing heavy lifting to project a specific brand of leadership.
It really is. The stones tell us what Ashoka wanted the world to think of him. He is constantly projecting his concept of Dhamma, which we'll explore deeply later, focusing on righteousness, social welfare, and this sort of paternal care for his subjects.
And then we pivot to the Buddhist texts.
Which present an entirely different set of biases.
Right.
The Buddhist texts are hagiographies, lives of the saints. The Sanskrit texts, like the Ashoka from North India, and the Pali texts, like the Mahavamsa from Sri Lanka, were written by monks centuries after Ashoka died.
Centuries later, that's a big gap.
Exactly. And their agenda was not to provide an accurate historical timeline. Their agenda was theological.
They had a point to prove.
Yes. They needed to demonstrate the miraculous world-altering power of the Buddha's teachings.
Right, so if you are a monk trying to prove your religion is the ultimate truth, and your biggest historical patron was the most powerful emperor on earth, you don't just write a dry political biography. You write a highly stylized, dramatized epic.
Precisely.
It's like taking that same modern CEO we just talked about, but now their life story is being told through a wildly stylized Broadway musical written 50 years later by their most devoted fan club.
And those fan clubs had competing regional interests, too.
Oh, they did?
Yeah, the North Indian texts naturally center the action around their own geography. They heavily feature Ashoka's son Kunala, but the Sri Lankan texts completely sideline Kunala.
Just write him out.
Basically. Instead, they emphasize a different son, Mahinda, who supposedly flew through the air to Sri Lanka to convert the island.
Flew through the air. Naturally.
Right. The Sri Lankan authors were deliberately shaping the narrative to legitimize their own island as the new, pure headquarters of global Buddhism.
So we are navigating a hall of mirrors here. Everything we are about to discuss requires us to triangulate between state-sponsored PR and religious mythology.
It's a balancing act.
Well, let's go to the beginning of the timeline and see how a prince actually navigates his way to the top of the Mauryan Empire. So Ashoka is born around 304 BCE in the capital city of Pataliputra.
Right.
His father is Emperor Bindusara. His mother is a woman named Subhadrangi, or sometimes called Dharma, and there is some debate about whether she was a Brahmin or a Kshatriya.
We should probably define those terms quickly just to understand the social stakes for him.
Yeah, please do.
So, Mauryan society was highly stratified, influenced by the Vedic Varna system. Brahmins were the priestly and scholarly class, holding immense spiritual and social authority.
Okay.
Kshatriyas were the warrior and ruling class, so your kings and generals.
Right.
If Ashoka's mother was a Brahmin, as some later legends suggest, just to elevate his spiritual pedigree, it would be a pretty significant cross-class alliance.
But if she was a Kshatriya?
Then it was a standard dynastic match. But regardless of her exact caste, she was not the chief queen, which meant Ashoka was definitely not the first in line for the throne.
Not only is he not first in line, but according to the Ashoka his father outright despised him.
He really did.
The text claims Bindusara couldn't stand Ashoka because the boy had incredibly rough, unappealing skin.
The physical description is fascinating, actually, because ancient courts were deeply invested in aesthetics. Physical perfection was often equated with divine favor and fitness to rule.
Right, the king has to look the part.
Exactly. Ashoka's rough skin, which some modern medical historians have speculated might have been a severe skin condition, it made him an outcast in a palace that really prized aesthetic grace.
It sounds to me like a classic narrative device, the whole ugly duckling trope. But there's this incredible story about a prophecy test that highlights his sheer ambition.
Oh, this is a great story.
So Bindusara wants to know which of his many sons is actually fit to be the next emperor. So he brings in an ascetic, a holy man named Pingala Vatsajiva.
Right. And the setting for this is the Garden of the Golden Pavilion.
Very scenic.
Bindusara gathers all princes, and the ascetic devises a blind test, declaring that the universe will reveal the future king based on who claims the best mount, the best seat, the best drink, and the best food.
And Ashoka just bulldozes the whole test. He doesn't wait to be evaluated for every single category. He steps forward and confidently declares that his own mount, seat, drink, and food are the absolute best.
Even though objectively he is riding this old elephant provided by a court minister named Radhagupta, while the favored heir, Susima, likely had the finest royal stallions available.
Right, he's faking it till he makes it.
But the ascetic, Pingala Vatsajiva, he recognizes the sheer unbending willpower in Ashoka. He secretly realizes Ashoka is the chosen one, but he is terrified of Bindusara's wrath because the emperor clearly favors Susima.
So what does he do?
The ascetic whispers the truth to Ashoka's mother and immediately flees the empire entirely to save his own life.
He just packs his bags and runs. That's hilarious. But here is where the logic of the court breaks down for me.
Oh, so?
Well, if Bindusara hates his physical appearance and strongly favors the eldest brother Susima, why does he give Ashoka these incredibly high-stakes, dangerous military commands?
The historical reality of managing a massive, decentralized, ancient empire provides the answer there. The Mauryan Empire at this time stretched from modern-day Afghanistan down into the Indian Peninsula.
It's huge.
It was a logistical nightmare to maintain control. When a distant, wealthy province like Taxila broke out in open rebellion, Bindusara couldn't afford to send an incompetent general, even if that general was his favorite son.
So Bindusara was just being pragmatic. He had a problem, and he knew Ashoka, despite being disliked, was an incredibly capable, ruthless tool to fix it.
That is one highly plausible interpretation. The other interpretation, which is favored by a lot of political historians, is that assigning Ashoka to the distant frontiers was a deliberate strategy of containment.
Like exiling him.
Exactly. Taxila and later Ujjain were vital, wealthy provinces, but they were far from the capital of Pataliputra. By sending Ashoka hundreds of miles away to fight brutal insurgencies, Bindusara accomplishes two things.
Okay.
He gets a competent commander in the field, and he physically removes a dangerous, ambitious rival from the imperial court. That clears the runway for his favored heir, Susima, to consolidate power at home.
So it's a win-win for the emperor. Let's talk about the logistics of that Taxila rebellion, because the Buddhist texts offer a story that is utterly absurd on its face, but I think it hides a really cool historical reality.
The weapons story.
Yes. The text says Bindusara sends Ashoka to crush the rebellion in Taxila. He gives him cavalry, elephants, chariots, but he explicitly refuses to give the army any weapons.
Right. And the Ashoka claims that when Ashoka realizes his army is unarmed, he doesn't panic. He simply proclaims to the universe that if he is destined to be the emperor, weapons will manifest.
Just magical thinking.
And miraculously, divine beings split the earth open and handfully forge weapons to his soldiers.
Very convenient.
And when he finally arrives at Taxila, the rebellious citizens are so awed by his presence that they lay down their arms, welcome him with a parade, and claim they only rebelled because of corrupt local ministers, not out of any hatred for the Mauryan crown.
Okay, stripping away the magic deities popping out of the dirt, what is actually happening here? If a king sends a prince into a hostile war zone with a massive army but zero logistical support, that is a meticulously engineered assassination attempt.
It really is.
It is a setup. Bindusara wanted the rebels to do his dirty work and kill Ashoka.
The deprivation of weapons is a powerful metaphor for being politically and financially cut off by the central state.
Exactly. So if Ashoka didn't have magic, how did an unfunded, unsupported general scrounge enough weaponry and logistics to arm thousands of men on the march? That requires staggering logistical genius.
It requires immense diplomatic and economic leverage. To arm an army on the march without state treasury backing, Ashoka would have had to forge rapid alliances with local regional governors.
You'd have to make deals.
Right, promising them future tax exemptions or political favors in exchange for access to their armories and granaries. He would have heavily leveraged mercenary networks and local artisan guilds, essentially issuing IOUs against his future potential as an emperor.
He crowdsourced his own invasion force.
He built a shadow state infrastructure on the fly. By the time he reached Taxila, the men in his army weren't fighting for Bindusara. They were fighting for Ashoka because Ashoka was the one feeding them and arming them.
And what about the peaceful surrender of Taxila?
That likely represents Ashoka brilliantly utilizing psychological warfare and amnesty. Instead of burning the city to the ground, he offered the local elites a face-saving exit. Blame the corrupt ministers, submit to my direct authority, and keep your local trade networks intact.
It's a master class in building a personal power base.
Yeah.
And he continues this when he's reassigned as the Viceroy of Ujjain, which was a massive commercial and cultural hub.
Very important city.
Right. And it's also during this time, traveling through a place called Vidisha, that he meets a merchant's daughter named Devi. She becomes his wife. And the critical detail here is that she was reportedly already a practicing Buddhist.
Her religious background is a crucial seed planted in his early life. It suggests that Ashoka had intimate exposure to Buddhist philosophy and monastic communities long before his famous dramatic conversion on the battlefield later in life.
But all this frontier success, building alliances, securing trade hubs, developing a fiercely loyal army, it sets a terrifying stage. Because the emperor in Pakradaputra is getting old, and ancient transitions of power are incredibly fragile.
Always a dangerous time.
Bindusara's health fails, and the game of Mauryan thrones begins.
The timing is really everything here. When Bindusara falls deathly ill, the empire's geography plays a fatal role. Susuma, the favored eldest son, the chosen heir, is not in the capital.
Right. Where is he?
He has ironically been deployed to Taxila to deal with a second uprising.
He's completely out of position, and Ashoka's allies in the capital see the vacuum.
The court factions mobilize instantly, and the primary orchestrator is a minister named Radhagupta.
The guy with the elephant.
The exact same minister who, years earlier, subtly backed Ashoka for the prophecy test. So Radhagupta and his faction approach the dying Bindusara. They frame it as a temporary measure for the stability of the realm. Install Ashoka on the throne just until Susima can march back from the frontier.
That is a completely transparent stalling tactic.
Of course it is, and Bindusara sees right through it. He furiously refuses.
I can imagine.
The tension in the throne room must have been suffocating. The texts claim Ashoka then steps forward, completely bypassing his father's authority, and declares that if the throne is his by divine right, the gods will place the crown on his head.
Wow. Bold move.
According to the dramatic legend, Bindusara dies of a hemorrhage right at that moment out of pure rage, and Ashoka assumes absolute control of the state apparatus.
But the crisis isn't over, because Susima is still out there. He has an army, and he is marching straight for Pataliputra to take his crown back. If two Mauryan armies clash, it could tear the subcontinent apart. How does Ashoka handle this?
With terrifying clinical efficiency. Ashoka doesn't meet Susima on an open battlefield where the outcome is uncertain. He relies on Radhagupta to engineer a trap at the gates of the capital.
A trap.
The legend states they constructed an elaborate trench outside the eastern gate, filled it with burning charcoal, and covered it with a deceptive layer of earth and grass.
That is awful.
When Susima arrived, eager to breach the city, he was lured toward the specific gate, fell into the hidden furnace, and was burned alive.
It is brutal, intimate violence. But the Buddhist chroniclers don't stop at one dead brother in a fire pit. This is where the numbers get wild.
Oh, yes.
The texts claim Ashoka systematically hunted down and murdered 99 of his half-brothers. Some texts say a flat 100. They claim he spared only one single brother, a man named Tissa or Vitashoka, simply because they shared the same mother.
We have to critically dismantle this number, though. The number 99 in ancient Indian literature is frequently used as a symbolic placeholder to represent a vast, overwhelming amount, or totality.
It's not a literal headcount.
Right. It is highly unlikely he had exactly 99 brothers, and even more unlikely he murdered all of them.
And we actually have hard archaeological proof that the 99 dead brothers story is a myth, don't we?
We do. And the proof comes from Ashoka himself. Years later, he carved Major Rock Edict number 5.
Okay, what does it say?
In this specific inscription, he details the creation of his new administrative bureaucracy. And he specifically mentions officers whose sole duty was to supervise the welfare, households, and harems of his brothers and sisters.
Okay, if you have government bureaucrats actively managing the estates and households of your brothers, it is biologically impossible that you murdered all of them.
Exactly.
It strongly suggests a significant number of his brothers survived the succession crisis, retained their aristocratic status, and lived under his administration.
Precisely. Now, a war of succession absolutely occurred. Ashoka undoubtedly ordered targeted executions of Susuma's core loyalists and any brothers who posed a direct military threat.
Sure.
But the systematic genocidal purge of 99 siblings is a complete fabrication.
So, why invent it? Why would Buddhist monks, writing centuries later, want to portray their greatest royal patron, the man who built their temples and funded their monasteries, as a psychopathic, mass-murdering monster in his youth? What is the theological payoff there?
It is the architecture of redemption. The monks were constructing a narrative about the absolute unmatched power of the Buddha's Dharma.
Okay, I think I see where this is going.
If Ashoka is just a moderately aggressive king who decides to adopt Buddhism, the story is politically interesting but spiritually weak.
Right, it doesn't pop.
However, if Ashoka is the most blood-soaked, wicked, fratricidal tyrant in human history, and the teachings of the Buddha are still potent enough to penetrate his heart and transform him into a saintly pacifist, well, that makes the religion look omnipotent.
The darker they paint the before picture, the more miraculous the after picture becomes.
Exactly.
And they do not hold back on that before picture. They really lean into the horror. They give him a terrifying moniker, Chandashoka, which translates to Ashoka the Fierce or Ashoka the Cruel.
Yes, Chandashoka.
Ashoka the Dana is packed with these incredibly gruesome, almost theatrical anecdotes about his early reign of terror.
They portray a ruler who is paranoid, sadistic, and utterly detached from the sanctity of human life. One of the most famous stories involves his ministers.
What happens with them?
Well, Ashoka felt his senior advisors were questioning his authority. To assert his dominance, he issued an order that was intentionally absurdly impossible. He commanded them to go out and cut down every single fruit-bearing and flower-bearing tree in the empire.
An ecological and logistical impossibility.
Exactly. And when the ministers returned and admitted they couldn't complete the task, the text claims Ashoka drew his sword and personally decapitated 500 of them right there in the throne room.
It's a pure loyalty test. Follow the impossible order or die. And it isn't just the administration. The cruelty extends to his private life. There's the story of the Ashoka tree.
Ah, the namesake tree, yes.
Tell us that one.
The legend tells us that Ashoka was strolling through the royal pleasure gardens with his harem of concubines. They came across a magnificent Ashoka tree in full bloom.
Okay.
But the women, supposedly still disgusted by Ashoka's rough, diseased skin, waited until he fell asleep on a bench. Out of pure spite and resentment toward him, they chopped the beautiful tree to pieces.
Just to get back at him.
Right. And when Ashoka awoke and realized what they had done, his retribution was apocalyptic. He ordered a pyre built and had 500 of his own concubines burned to death.
I mean, this is Caligula-level madness. It feels entirely fictional, like a cartoonish supervillain origin story.
It really does.
But the absolute peak of this narrative is the creation of a facility the text referred to as Ashoka's Hell.
The construction of this facility is detailed extensively in the texts. According to the legend, Ashoka's prime minister advised him that executing people personally was polluting his spirit and beneath his royal dignity.
Don't get your hands dirty, sire.
Exactly. He needed a proxy. So Ashoka orders a massive search and finds a sadistic village boy named Girika. This youth was so cruel he boasted he could torture the entire continent. Ashoka puts Girika in charge of a brand new, custom-built prison complex in the capital of Pataliputra.
And what fascinates me about this prison is the psychological warfare of its architecture. It wasn't a dark, miserable dungeon on a rocky cliff somewhere.
No, it was designed to be deceptive. From the outside, it was breathtaking. It was built to look like a luxurious palace or a heavenly paradise, with beautiful gates, lush gardens, and tranquil pools.
It looked inviting.
But once the victim stepped through the doors, it was a mechanized nightmare.
A literal factory of suffering.
Girika supposedly equipped it with cauldrons of boiling copper, iron instruments designed to pry open mouths to rip out tongues, and furnaces to roast men alive. The decree was that anyone who entered the doors, even by accident, could never leave alive.
The concept of an architectural honeypot, a torture chamber disguised as a five-star resort, is terrifying. But as a historian, when you look at these accounts, especially since travelers like Faxine and Xuanzang centuries later claimed they saw the ruins of this place, how do you parse the reality? Did Ashoka actually build a localized hell?
We have to view this through the lens of ancient statecraft mixed with religious allegory. Did ancient Mauryan kings use brutal corporal punishment, torture, and horrific prisons? Absolutely.
Right.
The Arthashastra, which is a famous ancient Indian treatise on statecraft written around this era, it explicitly details various methods of torture and execution for treason. So the existence of a grim state prison is highly probable.
With the resort facade.
The cartoonish, demonic exaggeration of Ashoka's hell, a place where the king studies underworld tortures just to replicate them on Earth, is almost certainly a mythological construct. It was designed by later writers to create a literal geographical hell from which Buddhism could rescue the emperor.
But here's the thing. We can debate whether the 500 decapitations or the torture chambers were real or exaggerated. But Ashoka's thirst for imperial expansion led to a very real, scientifically documented catastrophic bloodbath that altered the trajectory of world history.
The Kalinga War.
Let's talk about the defining military crisis of his life.
To understand the war, we have to understand the geography. By his 8th regnal year, around 260 BCE, Ashoka controlled almost the entire subcontinent. But there was a massive glaring exception on the eastern coast.
The Kingdom of Kalinga.
Right, which corresponds roughly to the modern state of Odisha. Kalinga was prosperous, fiercely independent, and most importantly, it controlled vital maritime trade routes and coastal ports that connected the subcontinent to Southeast Asia.
So it's a massive geopolitical vulnerability for the Mauryan Empire. You can't have a wealthy, independent rival controlling your access to the ocean right on your border.
Exactly. From a purely strategic standpoint, Kalinga had to be absorbed. But Kalinga possessed a formidable army, heavily reliant on a massive infantry and war elephants.
They weren't going down without a fight.
Not at all. Ashoka launched a full-scale invasion, and the resulting conflict was an absolute meat grinder.
And we don't have to rely on monks writing centuries later to know how bad it was. We have Ashoka's own words, carved into Major Rock Edict 13. I want to look closely at the numbers he provides because they are staggering for the ancient world.
They really are.
He states that 100,000 people were killed in action, 150,000 were carried away as captives or deportees, and he explicitly notes that many times that number perished later from the secondary effects of the war disease, starvation, and the collapse of the local economy.
Those numbers represent the total annihilation of a society. In the 3rd century BCE, removing hundreds of thousands of able-bodied farmers, artisans, and soldiers from a single region would trigger a catastrophic famine. It was total war in the most modern, horrifying sense.
Yeah.
But what makes Major Rock Edict 13 one of the most unique documents in human history is not the casualty list. It is the unprecedented psychological pivot that follows it.
Right. Because most ancient kings, whether we're talking about Egyptian pharaohs or Assyrian warlords, they would carve these numbers into stone as a boast. Look how many enemies I crushed.
Look how powerful I am. But Ashoka does the exact opposite. He expresses profound, agonizing remorse.
It's so unusual.
The edict reads, "The slaughter, death, and carrying away captive of the people is a matter of profound sorrow and regret to his sacred majesty." He openly admits that the violence inflicted on the Brahmins, the ascetics, and the innocent householders of Kalinga broke his heart.
This brings us to a massive chronological contradiction in the historical record. The narrative on the stones, Ashoka's own PR, claims that the trauma and guilt of witnessing this slaughter is what triggered his philosophical revolution.
Right, the cause and effect.
The blood of Kalinga washed away Ashoka, and he turned toward Dhamma, toward righteousness and peace. It's a very clean narrative.
It is clean, but the Sri Lankan Buddhist chronicles throw a massive wrench into that timeline. The Mahavamsa and Dipavamsa assert that Ashoka actually underwent his formal conversion to Buddhism in his fourth regnal year.
Which is 4 full years before he invaded Kalinga.
Exactly. This creates a massive paradox. If the Sri Lankan texts are accurate, we have to ask, how could a man who had already taken refuge in the Buddha, a religion fundamentally built on ahimsa or nonviolence, launch an unprovoked war of annihilation that killed 250,000 people?
How do modern historians reconcile that?
It is heavily debated. Some scholars suggest the Sri Lankan texts simply altered the timeline. They wanted to claim Ashoka was theirs as early as possible, effectively whitewashing his violent middle years.
Okay, that makes sense.
However, scholars like K.H.L. Egermont have proposed a more nuanced theory. Egermont suggests Ashoka did convert early, but his initial understanding of Buddhism was incredibly shallow or politically flexible.
Oh, like he bent the rules.
He may have viewed the Buddhist middle way not as strict pacifism, but as a doctrine that allowed for state violence if it served the ultimate greater good of unifying the empire. Only after seeing the physical reality of the Kalinga slaughter did the actual moral weight of the philosophy hit him.
Or we look at it through the lens of pure, unadulterated realpolitik. Kalinga was the last major geopolitical threat. He needed the ports. He needed the trade routes. So he commits the atrocity, secures the absolute borders of his empire, and then rebrands as a man of peace because there is literally no one left to conquer.
It is a brilliant strategy for imperial consolidation.
It is like a hostile corporate takeover. Imagine a massive conglomerate launching a vicious, illegal campaign to bankrupt their final competitor. They liquidate the rival's assets, fire thousands of workers, steal all the patents, and secure a total global monopoly.
Right.
And the very next morning, the CDO holds a press conference, announces they feel terrible about the stress caused, and rebrands the entire company as a philanthropic NGO dedicated to global harmony. And here is the kicker, and Ashoka explicitly does this. He apologizes for the war, but he does not give Kalinga back.
No, he doesn't.
He keeps the land. He keeps the resources. He just changes the mission statement.
He maintained the monopoly on violence while preaching peace. But regardless of the timing or the political convenience, the philosophical shift that followed was real, and it materialized in the form of his relationship with Buddhism.
Let's explore how that philosophical revolution actually happened on the ground. The legends give us a couple of very dramatic conversion stories. One of the most famous involves a 7-year-old boy.
Yes, the story of Nigroda. According to the Pali traditions, Ashoka was feeling spiritually empty. He was interviewing various Vedic priests and ascetics, showering them with wealth, but finding their behavior greedy and their philosophies lacking.
He was disillusioned.
One day, he looks out his palace window and sees a young, 7-year-old Buddhist novice monk walking down the street, begging for alms.
And the twist here is incredible because this isn't just a random kid.
It isn't. The boy is Nigroda, the posthumous son of Prince Sumana, the eldest brother that Ashoka had executed during his violent purge for the throne.
Wow.
Ashoka is completely unaware of the boy's true identity, but he is mesmerized by the child's serene, fearless demeanor. He calls the boy into the palace. Nigroda doesn't flinch at the imperial splendor. He calmly sits on the royal throne and delivers a short, simple sermon on the virtue of earnestness and mindfulness.
Yeah, that works.
The sheer moral clarity of the child supposedly instantly breaks through Ashoka's hardened exterior, triggering his formal conversion.
There is another legend that ties back to that horrific torture chamber we talked about earlier.
The story of the monk Samudra. In the Ashoka Vedana, a Buddhist monk named Samudra unwittingly wanders into Ashoka's hell while begging for food.
Wrong place at the wrong time.
The sadistic executioner, Garika, seizes him and throws him into a massive cauldron filled with boiling water, blood, and marrow. But Samudra, having attained deep spiritual realization, is impervious to the pain.
The fire doesn't burn him.
Exactly. When Ashoka arrives to inspect his prison, he looks into the cauldron and sees Samudra sitting calmly on a lotus flower that has miraculously bloomed amidst the boiling water.
That is a striking image.
Samudra then preaches to Ashoka, rebuking him for his cruelty. The shock of witnessing this absolute triumph of spirit over physical torment compels Ashoka to dismantle the prison, execute Garika, and embrace the Buddhist path.
These stories are clearly mythic, but they point to a fundamental question: why Buddhism? In the 3rd century BCE, the Indian subcontinent was a marketplace of competing philosophies.
Absolutely.
You had the entrenched, powerful Vedic Brahminical traditions. You had Jainism, which was incredibly strict in its nonviolence, and which Ashoka's own grandfather, Chandragupta, had famously adopted. You had the Ajivikas, a sect believing in absolute determinism. Why did Ashoka look at all these options and place the weight of the Mauryan Empire behind the Buddhists?
If we strip away the miracles, we see a highly pragmatic emperor evaluating ideological software for his empire. The traditional Vedic Brahminical system was deeply tied to a rigid hierarchical caste structure and centered on complex, exclusive rituals. It was inherently exclusionary.
Right.
Jainism, while morally pure, demanded a level of asceticism and extreme nonviolence that was practically impossible for a state attempting to run courts, prisons, and maintain border security.
You can't run an empire if you can't swat a fly.
Precisely. Buddhism, however, hit the sweet spot. It was highly organized, possessing a disciplined monastic framework, the Sangha, that could efficiently disseminate ideas.
So it was scalable.
Very scalable, and more importantly, it offered a universalizing ethic. It didn't care if you were a Greek merchant in Kandahar, a tribal farmer in the south, or an elite in Pataliputra. Its ethical framework bypassed the traditional caste hierarchies.
That makes total sense.
For an emperor trying to weld together a wildly diverse, multi-ethnic, multilingual continent, a universal, accessible moral code was the ultimate political glue.
And once he commits to this new software, he initiates a massive hardware upgrade across the empire to run it. I'm talking about the architectural explosion. The legends say a monk named Elder Yashas orchestrated a miracle where he eclipsed the sun, and upon that signal, Ashoka's workforce completed 84,000 stupas simultaneously across the earth.
While the number 84,000 is again symbolic, representing totality, the physical reality of his building program was revolutionary. Before Ashoka, Indian architecture was primarily built using wood, mud, and brick materials that decay.
But Ashoka wanted something lasting.
Ashoka shifted the empire to stone. He wanted permanence. He sponsored the original Mahabodhi temple at the exact site where the Buddha achieved enlightenment. He laid the foundational core of the great stupa at Sanchi.
But the most iconic symbols of his reign, the things that truly defined his physical footprint, are the pillars of Ashoka. Can we dig into the engineering mechanics of these things? Because it blows my mind. We are talking about solid shafts of sandstone, some weighing up to 50 tons, towering 40 to 50 feet in the air.
They are marvels of ancient engineering.
How does a 3rd century BCE society quarry a 50-ton rock, polish it, and move it hundreds of miles?
It required a mobilization of labor and logistics that only a fiercely centralized state could manage. The stone was primarily quarried at Chunar, near modern-day Varanasi. They didn't have heavy machinery. They used chisels, wedges, and water to crack the stone from the bedrock.
And the polish, the famous Mauryan polish that makes these stones shine almost like glass.
That is one of the great lost arts of ancient engineering. They likely used a meticulous, labor-intensive process involving agate burnishers and fine abrasives, grinding the stone for thousands of hours until it achieved a mirror-like luster.
Thousands of hours on one rock.
Yes. And once shaped and polished, these massive monoliths were rolled onto massive river barges using timber tracks and capstans, floated down the Ganges, and then dragged overland using hundreds of elephants and thousands of conscripted laborers.
Just brute force.
To stand them upright, they likely built massive earthen ramps, dragged the pillar to the top, and used gravity and ropes to slide the base into pre-dug foundation pits.
Think about the psychological impact of that. If you're a local farmer or a regional merchant, your world is built of wood and thatch. Suddenly, the Imperial Army rolls into your town square, builds a massive ramp, and erects a 50-ton mirror-polished stone tower topped with magnificent roaring lions.
It would be awe-inspiring.
And carved into the side of this alien object are the words of the emperor, dictating a new moral code. It's a permanent, unavoidable assertion of absolute power.
It functioned precisely as a state-run broadcast network, but instead of broadcasting radio waves, it broadcasted ideology in stone. And he was smart enough to localize the broadcast, too.
Oh, how so?
Well, in the heartland, the edicts were carved in Prakrit using the Brahmi script. But on the northwestern frontiers, in places like Kandahar and modern Afghanistan, he used Greek and Aramaic so the Hellenistic populations could read them.
And this brings us to the actual message carved onto these pillars. How did Ashoka govern the day-to-day lives of his citizens? He propagated this concept of Dhamma, but when you actually read the edicts, something feels like it's missing.
It is the most brilliant, subtle part of his administration. Ashoka is remembered as a Buddhist emperor, but if you search the major rock edicts for core Buddhist theology, you won't find it.
Wait, The man who supposedly built thousands of shrines to the Buddha doesn't even mention the Four Noble Truths on his own giant billboards. He doesn't preach about attaining nirvana.
He does not, because Dhamma was not a religious catechism, it was an imperial civic ideology. When he translated Dhamma into Greek for the western edges of the empire, he didn't use a word tied to Buddhist awakening. He used the Greek word eusebe, which means piety, reverence, or civic duty.
So what were the actual rules of Dhamma if it wasn't strictly Buddhism?
It was a lowest common denominator morality designed for universal acceptance. The edicts command respect for parents and elders. They demand generosity toward friends, acquaintances, and ascetics of all religious sects.
Okay, pretty standard good neighbor stuff.
Right. They call for the proper treatment of enslaved people and servants. It was an overarching umbrella of social welfare and tolerance that no reasonable person, regardless of their specific god, could argue against.
Establishing a baseline civic morality sounds wonderful in theory. But how do you enforce respect for your parents across an entire subcontinent? You can't just carve it on a rock and hope everyone plays nice.
No, you enforce it through bureaucracy. Ashoka created a completely new class of high-ranking government officials called the Dhamma Mahamanas, which translates roughly to officers of righteousness or morality officers.
What was their specific job description?
Their mandate, as carved in the rocks, was to tour the empire and inspect the administration of justice. They were tasked with ensuring the welfare of the elderly, the destitute, and orphans.
Like ancient social workers.
Exactly. They were specifically ordered to protect the rights of all religious communities, not just Buddhists, but the Brahmins, the Jains, the Ajivikas, everyone. They were also responsible for reviewing prison sentences, sometimes offering early release to those with large families or the elderly.
Okay, I have to challenge the utopian framing of this. On paper, a Dhamma Mahamata sounds like an ancient social worker mixed with a civil rights lawyer. But let's look at the mechanics of power. If I am a regional governor, and suddenly the emperor sends an official who reports only to him, and this official is roaming my province, inspecting my jails, interviewing my subjects, and auditing my local courts to ensure everyone is exhibiting righteous conduct, that is not a charity program.
I see where you're going with this.
That is an intelligence gathering network. That is a surveillance state cloaked in the language of morality.
That is a highly sophisticated and widely supported modern historical analysis. By establishing these morality officers, Ashoka brilliantly bypassed the traditional regional power structures. These officers were the eyes and ears of the emperor, penetrating the local level under the guise of enforcing ethical behavior.
Right.
If a local lord was getting too powerful or corrupt, the Dhamma Mamata could step in, citing a violation of the emperor's moral law, and assert direct imperial control. It was a mechanism for extreme centralization.
It's the ultimate soft power check on local rebellion. And he extended this control even further, down into the very ecosystem. Modern environmentalists often herald Ashoka as this ancient pioneer of animal rights.
And the edicts do read like groundbreaking environmental legislation. He abolished the grand imperial hunting excursions, which were massive, destructive affairs. He severely restricted the consumption of meat in the royal kitchens, eventually claiming they only killed 2 peacocks and a deer a day.
Wow, that's a big cutback for a royal court.
He established botanical gardens, ordered the planting of medicinal herbs and banyan trees along roads for shade, and set up veterinary clinics for animals. He even issued edicts explicitly banning the burning of forests without a specific agricultural reason, essentially outlawing wanton ecological destruction.
Which, for the 3rd century BCE, is genuinely astonishing. But again, applying our cynical lens of state control, how does banning the burning of forests or restricting hunting help him lock down the empire?
It is about monopolizing the right to violence and controlling the margins of society. The forests were often outside direct state control. They were the domain of tribal groups and potential rebel militias who relied on hunting and slash-and-burn agriculture.
Ah, so it targets them.
By dictating what could be hunted, when it could be hunted, and forbidding the unapproved clearing of land, Ashoka was legally extending the reach of the imperial state into the wilderness. He was dictating the food supply and standardizing the culture. If you control how people interact with the natural world, you control their daily survival.
So we have an emperor who has built a massive surveillance network disguised as a charity and who dictates the eating habits of a continent. This brings us to the final phase of his life and the shadows of the royal court. Because while the public epigraphic face of the empire is one of absolute peace, tolerance, and environmental stewardship, the inner workings of Ashoka's mind and his palace were still deeply tainted by hubris, jealousy, and violence.
The psychological toll of holding absolute, unchecked power for decades is immense, and the Buddhist texts, despite trying to paint him as a saint, inadvertently reveal that Ashoka's pacifism had severe limits when his ego or his faith was directly insulted.
There's a story set well after his conversion that is incredibly disturbing.
Yes. The texts relate an incident involving a citizen in the city of Punjravardhana. This individual supposedly drew a picture depicting the Buddha bowing down to a Jain teacher named Nataputta.
Which, in the context of the time, is a massive theological insult.
It was perceived as extreme blasphemy. When word of this drawing reached Ashoka, his reaction was not a measured, mindful response. The text claims he ordered the immediate massacre of 18,000 Jains and Adarvikas in that region in a single day.
Wait, the man who just outlawed setting fire to the forest because it might hurt insects ordered the slaughter of 18,000 people over a cartoon.
And it gets worse. Shortly after, a similar incident occurred right in the capital of Pataliputra. A man drew a similar offensive picture. Ashoka didn't just execute him, he had the man and his entire family locked in their house and burned alive.
That's horrifying.
He then reportedly placed a bounty on the head of any Jain ascetic, offering a gold coin for every severed head brought to him.
As a historian, do you believe these massacres actually happened? It completely shatters the entire concept of Dhamma.
Most modern historians view these specific accounts as highly suspect. They were likely fabricated or wildly exaggerated by later Buddhist authors who were engaged in fierce sectarian rivalries with the Jains and Ajivikas.
So they were basically smearing their rivals using Ashoka's name.
They wanted to portray Ashoka as a militant, uncompromising defender of their specific faith. However, the critical takeaway is not whether 18,000 people died on a Tuesday. It's the fact that centuries later, authors felt comfortable attributing such terrifying, explosive violence to him.
Because it was believable.
Exactly. It suggests that the cultural memory of Ashoka was never purely that of a gentle pacifist. He remained an ancient autocrat with a reputation for absolute terror if crossed.
It reminds me of certain modern tycoons or tech billionaires who undergo this massive public rebranding. They go on silent meditation retreats, they hire PR teams to preach philanthropic zen and universal harmony to the masses, and they claim they are completely detached from ego. But the absolute second someone threatens their market share, mocks their brand, or challenges their authority, they ruthlessly deploy an army of lawyers and fixers to completely destroy that person's life. Ashoka's ego didn't vanish into enlightenment, it just found a new, holier vehicle.
That is an incredibly apt comparison. He viewed himself not just as a king, but as a cosmic necessity. The religious texts even rationalize his total domination of the earth through karmic destiny.
How so?
They created a story that in a past life, Ashoka was a small boy named Jaya who saw the Buddha walking by. Innocently, the boy placed a handful of dirt into the Buddha's begging bowl, sincerely imagining it was a fine meal. Because of that single, pure, karmic act of giving, the universe rewarded him by making him the absolute ruler of the entire world in his next life.
I gave the Buddha some dirt, so now I own the planet. It's the ultimate divine mandate. And this intense pressure, this cosmic ego, didn't just affect his administration. It warped the dynamics inside his own palace. Let's look at the royal harem, because the shadows of the court were full of cutthroat palace intrigue.
The queens wielded immense, often unseen influence over the direction of the empire. The texts focus heavily on two specific wives. First, there is Queen Asandamitten, who is portrayed as the ideal, spiritually elevated consort. The monks go out of their way to prove she was practically superhuman in her karmic merit.
There's a bizarre story about a test with cake, right?
Yes. Ashoka supposedly wanted to prove to the rest of the court how special Asandametta was. So he ordered his bakers to prepare 16,000 identical cakes. He secretly placed his imperial seal inside only one of them. He then had all his wives and concubines choose a cake. Asandametta, guided entirely by the invisible hand of her immense past life karma, instantly reaches out and selects the exact cake containing the seal.
Okay, logistically, having 16,000 wives and concubines sounds like an absolute nightmare of jealousy and factionalism.
And that jealousy proved toxic after Asandametta passed away. Ashoka eventually elevated a younger queen named Tisharakshita to the position of chief consort. Tisharakshita, however, did not share his deep devotion to Buddhism.
She wasn't a fan.
In fact, she grew insanely, obsessively jealous of Ashoka's daily worship of the sacred Bodhi tree, the actual physical tree under which the Buddha was said to have achieved enlightenment.
Wait, she was jealous of a plant?
She viewed the tree as a rival for the emperor's affection and time. Her jealousy became so consuming that she enlisted the help of a sorceress. They used black magic, incantations, and physically poisoned the roots of the Bodhi tree in an attempt to wither and destroy it.
It is the ultimate act of domestic, imperial sabotage. You love this symbol of peace more than me, so I am going to assassinate the tree.
When the tree began to die, Ashoka fell into a deep depression, neglecting the state. Only when Tisharakshita realized that killing the tree might actually kill the emperor out of grief did she reverse the spell and nurse the tree back to health.
That is wild.
But the story brilliantly highlights the core contradiction of his reign. He could carve edicts about universal harmony into 50-ton pillars and broadcast them across a continent, but he couldn't stop the jealousy, the poison, and the chaos inside his own bedroom. He could polish the stones, but he couldn't completely polish human nature.
Which brings us to the end of our deep dive. The distance we've traveled today is immense. We started by looking at the epic mythological timelines of Jain cosmology, where heroes like Prince Rama operate in cycles of 84,000 years. And we landed in the hard dirt of the 3rd century BCE, exploring the scientifically verifiable yet fiercely propagandized reality of Ashoka the Great.
We've seen the sheer mechanical genius required to build a continent-spanning empire. We examined how he weaponized the unimaginable trauma of the Kalinga War to pioneer a revolutionary state ideology. He transformed a blood-soaked administration by utilizing massive architectural projects, engineering a universal moral code of Dhamma, and deploying an army of morality officers to quietly enforce his will.
Yet, when you peel back the PR, the man himself remains a deeply contradictory puzzle. He's a pacifist who loudly apologized for massacre, but quietly kept the conquered land. He was a devoted Buddhist who stripped the theology out of his public edicts to create a generic, enforceable civic religion. He was a supposedly enlightened ruler who still operated with the terrifying, absolute paranoia of an ancient autocrat.
He was a man trying to navigate the impossible tension between the violent realities of maintaining an empire and a genuine, if politically useful, desire to engineer a moral society.
And that tension leaves us with a final, provocative thought for you to mull over until our next deep dive. We've spent this entire time dissecting the brilliance of Ashoka's shift to pacifism and moral governance. But look at the long arc of history. By abandoning aggressive military expansion, by officially telling his sons and grandsons to put down their swords, cease hunting, and focus entirely on internal morality and Dhamma, did Ashoka inadvertently destroy the Mauryan military machine.
It is the ultimate paradox of peace.
Exactly. Did his beautiful philosophical revolution soften the edges of the warrior class so much that it planted the seeds for the empire's rapid, catastrophic collapse just a few decades after his death? Did the very ideology meant to save his soul end up dooming his dynasty? Just something for you to think about. Because when you step into the world of history, just like those lost pillars buried in the jungle, the truth is never sitting right on the surface. You always have to dig.